The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the royal estate as dozens of guests gathered for what was meant to be a peaceful garden party. Children ran between the carefully arranged tables while adults sipped tea and exchanged pleasantries. Among the crowd, 10-year-old Prince George stood near a refreshment table. His posture straight and proper as he had been taught since birth. He wore a light blue shirt and navy trousers, his hair neatly combed to the side. The young prince was listening politely to an elderly duchess, who was telling him about her prize-winning roses when the first sign of trouble appeared. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son from her first marriage, had arrived at the event with his own children. At 48 years old, Tom was known in certain circles as a food writer and critic. But he had always existed somewhat on the periphery of royal life. He was not a working royal, held no official title, and often seemed uncomfortable at these formal gatherings. On this particular day, Tom appeared more agitated than usual. His face was flushed, and he kept checking his phone repeatedly. His jaw clenched in obvious frustration. The garden party was being held to celebrate a local charity that supported children's literacy programs. Queen Camilla had organized the event, and the grounds were filled with families from the community alongside members of the royal household. Prince William and Catherine were present, though they had stepped away momentarily to greet some of the charity organizers near the main pavilion. This left George under the watchful eye of his protection officer, who stood a respectful distance away. Allowing the young prince some space to interact naturally with guests, Tom's children had run off to play with other kids. Near a small fountain, at the far end of the garden, he stood alone, scrolling through his phone with increasing irritation. Whatever message he had received seemed to darken his mood considerably. He drained his champagne glass quickly and set it down on a passing waiter's tray with more force than necessary. Several guests glanced his way, noting his demeanor but saying nothing. Royal events were always filled with unspoken tensions, carefully managed smiles, and problems swept quietly under elegant carpets. George excused himself from the Duchess and began walking toward where his younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, were playing a game of croquet with some other children. His path took him directly past where Tom was standing. The young prince nodded politely at Tom as he approached, offering a small smile as protocol demanded. For a moment, it seemed Tom might ignore the gesture entirely. His eyes were fixed on his phone screen, his thumb moving rapidly as he typed out what appeared to be an angry message. Then something shifted. Tom looked up from his phone and locked eyes with George. The boy slowed his pace slightly, uncertain whether he should stop to exchange greetings with his step-grandmother's son. In the complex hierarchy of royal relationships, their connection was unusual. Tom was not technically George's step-uncle because Camilla had married Charles after William was already an adult. The relationship was cordial, but distant. Marked by occasional interactions at family gatherings and little else, Tom suddenly reached out as George was about to pass him. His hand shot out and grabbed the young prince's arm just above the elbow. George stopped abruptly, surprise registering on his face. Tom's grip was firm, his fingers wrapping around the boy's slender arm with enough pressure to be uncomfortable. George looked down at the hand holding him, then back up at Tom's face with a mixture of confusion and concern. He had been taught how to handle many situations as a future king, but this unexpected physical contact from someone who should know better left him momentarily speechless. Tom leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to George's level. His breath smelled of champagne, and his eyes had a wild, unfocused quality that suggested he might have had more to drink than the single glass anyone had seen him consume. He began to speak in a low, urgent tone, though his words were not clear to anyone nearby. George tried to pull his arm back gently, using the diplomatic approach he had been taught, for extricating himself from uncomfortable situations without causing offense. But Tom's grip only tightened. The young prince's protection officer noticed the interaction immediately. From his position 20 feet away, he saw George's body language change from relaxed to tense. He saw the way Tom was holding the boy's arm and the uncomfortable angle at which George was being held. The officer began moving toward them, his pace quick but not yet running. He needed to assess whether this was a genuine threat or simply an awkward family moment that required tactful intervention. Other guests were starting to notice now. Conversations faltered as people turned to look at the unusual scene. Tom was still gripping George's arm, and he had begun to pull the boy closer to him. George resisted, planting his feet and trying to maintain his balance. His face had gone pale, and there was a flash of something in his eyes that might have been fear or anger or both. For a child who had spent his entire life being treated with careful respect, this rough handling was completely outside his experience. Tom's voice grew louder. Though his words were still unclear to most observers, he seemed to be saying something about fairness, about treatment, about respect. His free hand was gesturing wildly, his phone still clutched in his fingers. Spittle flew from his lips as he spoke, and his face had turned an alarming shade of red. Whatever had set him off, whatever message had arrived on his phone, had pushed him past the point of self-control. In this moment, he was not thinking about protocol or consequences or the fact that he was manhandling the future King of England in front of dozens of witnesses. George finally spoke, his voice surprisingly steady given the circumstances. He said something short and firm, though only Tom could hear the exact words. Whatever the young prince said, it had no effect on Tom's behavior. In fact, it seemed to make things worse. Tom's jaw clenched even tighter, and he suddenly yanked hard on George's arm, pulling the boy several steps toward him. The movement was violent enough that George stumbled, nearly losing his footing on the grass. That was when the protection officer broke into a run. His hand went to his side, where his radio was clipped, and he barked a single word into it. Around the garden, other security personnel immediately went on alert. The atmosphere shifted in an instant from pleasant garden party to potential security incident. Guests began backing away, creating a circle of space around Tom and George. Some people gasped. A few pulled out their phones, though they would quickly be stopped from taking photos or videos by security staff. The protection officer reached them in seconds. His approach was fast but controlled, his body language conveying both authority and the implicit threat of force, if necessary. He positioned himself slightly to Tom's side, one hand outstretched in what could have been either a calming gesture or preparation to strike if needed. His voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel that cut through Tom's agitated ranting. He addressed Tom by name and firmly told him to release Prince George immediately. Tom seemed to snap back to reality for just a moment. He looked at the protection officer, then down at his own hand, still gripping the young prince's arm, then at the circle of staring faces around them. For a brief second, it seemed he might comply, might release George and step back and apologize for his inexplicable behavior. But then his face hardened again. His fingers dug into George's arm even more firmly, hard enough now that there would certainly be bruises later. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to argue or explain or justify what he was doing. The protection officer did not give him the chance. In one smooth, practiced movement, he stepped forward and broke Tom's grip on George's arm using a technique designed to apply pressure without causing injury. Tom's hand was forced open, and George was able to pull free. The young prince immediately stepped back. Putting distance between himself and Tom, his left hand instinctively went to his right arm where Tom had been holding him, rubbing the spot that was already beginning to ache. His face was flushed now, not with embarrassment, but with the aftermath of adrenaline. He looked shaken, but determined to maintain his composure. Even at 10 years old, George understood that all eyes were on him, that how he handled this moment would be observed and discussed. He straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin, a gesture so reminiscent of his great-grandmother Queen Elizabeth that several older guests felt a chill of recognition. The protection officer positioned himself between George and Tom, creating a physical barrier. His colleague had arrived now, along with 2 other security personnel. Tom was surrounded, though they maintained a respectful distance. He was not being treated as an immediate threat requiring physical restraint, but he was clearly not going to be allowed anywhere near Prince George again. Tom's face had gone from red to pale, the reality of what he had just done seemingly beginning to penetrate. Through whatever fog of anger and alcohol had driven his actions, from across the garden Prince William came running. Someone had radioed him immediately, and he had broken away from his conversation mid-sentence. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the kind of cold anger that is far more frightening than any amount of shouting. Catherine was right behind him, her hand reaching for George even as she took in the scene with sharp, assessing eyes. Other members of the royal household were converging on the area now, including several senior staff members who understood immediately that this situation needed to be managed carefully. George turned toward his approaching parents, and for the first time, the careful composure cracked just slightly. His lower lip trembled for just a moment before he controlled it. William reached him first, dropping to one knee so he could look his son directly in the eye. His hands went to George's shoulders, gentle where Tom's grip had been rough. He asked quietly if George was all right, if he was hurt. The young prince nodded, though his hand still rubbed his arm unconsciously. Catherine arrived a heartbeat later, her own hands joining William's in a protective cocoon around their eldest child. She looked over at Tom with an expression that would have withered flowers. The protection officers had moved Tom several yards away now, speaking to him in low, urgent tones. He seemed to be deflating, his aggressive posture melting into something that looked almost like confusion. He kept shaking his head, whether in denial or disbelief was unclear. Queen Camilla had been inside the house when the incident occurred, but she emerged now, her face drawn with concern and what might have been embarrassment. She moved toward the group, her steps quick despite her age. She looked at George first, her eyes scanning him for signs of injury, then at Tom with an expression impossible to read. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. What could she possibly say in this moment that would make any of it better? The other guests remained frozen in place, watching the drama unfold. The garden party was effectively over, though no official announcement had been made. Parents were beginning to quietly collect their children. Staff members moved efficiently through the crowd, making reassuring sounds while simultaneously encouraging people to begin making their way toward the exits. This kind of discreet management was what the royal household excelled at, the ability to contain scandal and move people along without ever raising voices or creating additional scenes. William stood up, keeping one hand on George's shoulder. He looked at the senior protection officer and said something quietly. The officer nodded and began speaking into his radio again. More security personnel arrived, and Tom was being firmly but politely escorted toward a side entrance of the house. He went without resistance now, all the fight seeming to have drained out of him. He glanced back once at George, his expression now clearly showing regret, but the damage was done. Whatever had possessed him to put his hands on the young prince, whatever frustration or anger had driven that moment of madness could not be taken back. George stood between his parents, their presence a shield and a comfort. Around them, the garden party was dissolving into whispered conversations and meaningful looks. This incident would be discussed at dinner tables across Britain and beyond by evening. Videos might already be circulating despite security's best efforts to prevent phones from being used. The royal family would need to decide quickly how to address what had happened. What statement to release, what consequences should follow. But in this moment, all that mattered was that George was safe, shaken but unhurt, standing in the afternoon sunlight surrounded by people who would do anything to protect him. Inside the house, Tom Parker Bowles sat in a small drawing room that had been hastily converted into an impromptu holding area. Two protection officers stood by the door, their postures relaxed but alert. Tom had his head in his hands, his phone now sitting on the table in front of him, face down. The champagne buzz had worn off completely, replaced by a crushing weight of realization about what he had done. His hands were shaking slightly, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and haunted. A senior member of the royal household staff entered the room. A man in his 60s named Malcolm, who had served the family for over 30 years. Malcolm had seen scandals come and go, had managed crises that never made it to the press, had developed a reputation for handling delicate situations with firmness and discretion. He sat down across from Tom without greeting him, simply folding his hands on the table and waiting. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable, till Tom finally broke. He started to explain, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. There had been a text message from his ex-wife, something about their daughter, a fight about money and custody arrangements that had been going on for months. She had sent him a particularly cruel message just as he arrived at the garden party, something designed to hurt him, to make him feel like a failure as a father. The champagne had gone to his head faster than usual because he had skipped lunch, and when he saw George walking past, looking so perfect and protected and privileged, something inside him had snapped. Malcolm listened without expression, letting Tom exhaust himself with explanations and justifications. When Tom finally fell silent, Malcolm spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. He told Tom that none of what he had said mattered, that there was no excuse, no explanation that could justify putting hands on a child, particularly that child. Tom's personal problems, however real and difficult they might be, were completely irrelevant in the face of what he had done. Tom tried to interrupt, to say something more, but Malcolm held up one hand and Tom fell silent immediately. The older man explained in careful detail exactly what Tom had done from a security perspective. He had assaulted the heir to the throne in front of witnesses. He had created a situation where protection officers had been forced to physically intervene. He had caused distress to a child who was under the protection of the crown. The words hung in the air, like pronouncements of doom, and Tom seemed to shrink in his chair with each one. Outside the room, in a much larger and more comfortable sitting area, Prince William and Catherine sat with George between them. The young prince had been examined by a doctor who traveled with the family, and while there was no serious injury, there were indeed bruises forming on his upper arm in the clear shape of finger marks. Photographs had been taken for documentation purposes, though what those photos would be used for remained to be seen. George had been quiet since the incident, answering questions when asked but otherwise seeming lost in thought. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis had been taken to a separate room with their nanny, spared the details of what had happened to their older brother. William and Catherine had agreed without discussion that the younger children did not need to be exposed to the adult conversations and decisions that would follow. George, however, was old enough to be part of at least some of the discussion about what happened next. His opinion mattered, even if he was only 10 years old. Catherine spoke first, her voice gentle as she asked George how he felt about everything. The young prince considered the question seriously before answering. He said he felt confused more than anything else. He had never been grabbed like that before, never been handled roughly by an adult. It had scared him in the moment, but now that it was over, he mostly felt sorry for Tom. He could see that something had been wrong with him, that he was not acting normally. George's compassion was genuine, but William and Catherine exchanged a look over his head that spoke volumes about their own feelings on the matter. William explained to George that being compassionate was admirable, but it was also important to understand that adults should never put their hands on children in anger, regardless of what personal problems they might be having. George nodded, clearly trying to process this information, along with everything else that had happened. He asked what would happen to Tom now, whether he would be arrested or sent away. Catherine answered honestly that they were not sure yet, that decisions were being made by various people, including security personnel, household staff, and other family members. Queen Camilla had requested a private meeting with William and Catherine, but they had declined until they had time to settle George and discuss matters between themselves. The request sat like an unwelcome weight, knowing that at some point they would need to face Camilla and navigate the incredibly awkward situation of her son having assaulted their son. The relationship between Camilla and William had always been complicated, marked by his lingering loyalty to his late mother Diana and his practical acceptance of his father's choice of wife. This incident threatened to strain an already delicate balance in another part of the house. King Charles had been informed of what happened. He had been in London attending to official business and had not been present at the garden party. The news had reached him via a carefully worded phone call from his private secretary, and his reaction had been swift and decisive. He was returning immediately to deal with the situation in person. His staff had heard the tone in his voice. It's a particular quality of controlled anger that meant heads would roll and decisions would be made quickly. Charles had always been protective of his grandchildren, and an attack on George was something he would take very seriously indeed. The guests from the garden party had all departed by now, ushered out with apologies and assurances that everything was fine. Just a small medical emergency that had been handled. The staff knew better, of course. Within the household, word had spread quickly about what Tom had done. There was shock and anger among those who had watched Prince George grow up, who felt a personal connection to the young boy despite their professional roles. Some expressed surprise that Tom had been allowed to leave with just an escort rather than being immediately arrested. But others understood the complications of prosecuting a member of the extended royal family. Tom remained in the drawing room, Malcolm having left him alone with his thoughts and the silent protection officers. He had tried calling his mother several times, but Camilla was not answering her phone. She was, in fact, sitting in her private quarters, struggling with her own complicated emotions. Her son had done something unforgivable, had put his hands on her step-grandson, had created a scandal that would reflect badly on everyone. But he was still her son, still the child she had raised, and maternal instinct warred with her duty to the crown and her place in the royal family. She had sent a note to William and Catherine, a carefully handwritten message expressing her horror at what had occurred and her deepest apologies. She had offered to speak with them whenever they felt ready. It emphasized that she fully supported whatever consequences they felt were appropriate. The note had been delivered by a trusted staff member, and it sat now on the table in front of Catherine, who had read it twice and then set it aside without comment. William had not even glanced at it. As afternoon faded into early evening, King Charles arrived at the estate. His car pulled up to a side entrance, avoiding the main gates where a few photographers had begun to gather after catching wind that something unusual had happened. Charles moved through the house with purpose, stopping first to see George. The boy stood when his grandfather entered, instinctively falling into the formal behavior expected during official interactions. But Charles waved that away and pulled his grandson into a tight hug, holding him for a long moment before pulling back to examine him. Charles asked the same questions William and Catherine had already asked, received the same thoughtful answers. He looked at the bruises on George's arm with an expression that made everyone in the room grateful they were not Tom Parker Bowles. He listened as George explained what had happened in his own words, how Tom had seemed upset before he grabbed him, how the protection officer had moved so quickly. Charles nodded throughout, his face grave, storing every detail away for the conversations that would follow. After speaking with George, Charles conferred privately with William and Catherine. The discussion was serious and lengthy, covering not just the immediate incident, but the broader implications for family relationships and security protocols. William made his position clear from the start. He wanted Tom prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. What had happened was assault, plain and simple. The fact that Tom was connected to the royal family should not shield him from consequences. Catherine agreed, though she raised practical concerns about the media circus that would follow if criminal charges were filed. Charles listened to his son's anger, understanding it completely. He felt it himself, a burning rage at anyone who would dare to hurt his grandson. But he also had to consider the political and public relations aspects of the situation. A criminal prosecution would be brutal and public, with every detail dissected in the press. George would likely have to testify, would have to relive the incident in a courtroom setting. The royal family's dirty laundry would be aired for all to see, and Camilla, who had worked hard to build public acceptance, would be dragged into the mess through no fault of her own. William argued that protecting the institution should not come before protecting George. His son had been assaulted, and allowing the perpetrator to walk away with just a stern talking to sent the wrong message. It suggested that royal connections could buy immunity from consequences, that the rules did not apply equally to everyone. Charles countered that there were ways to ensure consequences without resorting to criminal prosecution. That Tom could be effectively exiled from royal life, banned from all family events, and made to understand in no uncertain terms that his actions were unacceptable. The debate continued, with Catherine mediating between the two men she loved most in the world. She understood William's fury, shared it even, but she also saw Charles's point about protecting George from additional trauma. A court case would be difficult for a 10-year-old boy, even one trained in public appearances and speaking carefully. Every detail would be picked apart, every moment of the incident replayed and analyzed. She asked whether there might be a middle ground, something that held Tom accountable, while minimizing the impact on George. Meanwhile, Malcolm had returned to the drawing room where Tom waited. He informed Tom that King Charles had arrived and would be speaking with him shortly. Tom's face went even paler if that was possible. He asked whether he should call a lawyer, and Malcolm replied that he was certainly entitled to do so if he wished, but that this was not yet a police matter. However, Malcolm added ominously, that could change very quickly, depending on how the next few hours unfolded. Tom stood and began pacing, his anxiety manifesting in constant movement. He talked almost to himself, going over what had happened again and again, trying to understand his own actions. He admitted he could not fully explain why he had grabbed George, why he had not just let the boy walk past. It was as if something had broken inside him in that moment. All his frustrations and failures channeling into one terrible decision. He asked if George was all right, if the young prince was frightened. Malcolm answered honestly that George was shaken but recovering, that he was with his parents and being well cared for. Tom asked then the question that had been building since the moment the protection officer broke his grip on George's arm. What was going to happen to him now? Malcolm regarded him steadily and said that decision was still being made, that it involved multiple parties and considerations, but he made it clear that Tom's life as he knew it was over. Whether criminal charges followed or not, his relationship with the royal family was irreparably damaged. He would not be welcome at family events, would not be included in gatherings, would be effectively cut off from that world entirely. The weight of those words settled over Tom like a physical thing. Whatever tenuous connection he had maintained to royal life through his mother's marriage was gone now. It burned away in a moment of anger and poor judgment. His children would suffer for this too. Losing their connection to young royal cousins, missing out on experiences they had taken for granted. The full scope of consequences was beginning to dawn on him, and it was crushing. King Charles finally made his way to the drawing room. Malcolm left, closing the door behind him, but remaining just outside. Tom stood as Charles entered, and for a long moment the two men just looked at each other. Tom opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize or explain, but Charles held up a hand, stopping him. When Charles did speak, his voice was cold and hard, stripped of any warmth or understanding. He told Tom exactly what he thought of men who put their hands on children, of adults who could not control themselves, of people who abused positions of privilege and connection. Charles made it clear that if the decision were his alone, Tom would already be in a police station being charged with assault. The only reason that had not happened yet was consideration for George's well-being and the impact public prosecution would have on him. But that reprieve came with conditions. Tom would leave the estate immediately and would not return. He would make no public statements about what had happened. He would not contact George or attempt any kind of apology or explanation directly to the boy. If criminal charges were eventually filed, he would cooperate fully and accept whatever judgment came without fighting it or creating additional drama. Tom nodded at each point, accepting the terms because he had no choice and because, somewhere beneath his own self-pity and regret, he understood he deserved whatever came next. Charles was not finished, however. He explained that Camilla's position was not affected by what Tom had done, that she would continue in her role as queen consort and would not be held responsible for her adult son's actions. However, it was understood that she would have no contact with Tom until the family decided otherwise, that she would respect the boundaries being set. Tom flinched at that, understanding that he was losing not just his peripheral connection to royal life, but his relationship with his mother, at least temporarily. Charles turned and left without another word. The protection officers stepped forward, and Tom understood it was time to go. He was escorted through the house using back corridors and service stairs, avoiding any chance of encountering George or other family members. His car had been brought around to a rarely used exit, and within minutes he was driving away from the estate, leaving behind a mess that would take months if not years to fully resolve. As he drove, his phone began buzzing with calls and messages from friends and family who had heard something had happened, though details were still vague. He ignored them all, unable to face explaining what he had done. The following morning broke gray and drizzly, matching the mood inside the royal estate. Prince George woke early, as he always did. For a few peaceful moments before full consciousness returned, everything seemed normal. Then he moved his arm and felt the ache where Tom had gripped him, and the previous day's events came flooding back. He lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling. trying to organize his thoughts about what had happened. His protection officer had been different. When arriving for duty that morning, George noticed immediately that it was not the same man who had pulled Tom away from him. That officer, whose name was James, had been replaced by someone new. George asked why. The new officer explained gently that James had not done anything wrong but that protocol required a temporary reassignment while the incident was reviewed. George understood what that meant. James was being questioned about how Tom had gotten close enough to grab him in the first place, whether the security arrangement had been adequate. This bothered George more than he expected. James had protected him, had moved quickly and efficiently to end the situation. Now James was being punished somehow, removed from his position because he had not prevented something that seemed impossible to predict. George determined that he would speak to his father about it, that he would make sure everyone understood James had done exactly what he was supposed to do. The young prince was learning that even when you tried to do the right thing, there could be complicated consequences. Downstairs, William and Catherine were having breakfast with Charlotte and Louis, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for the younger children. Charlotte had asked why they had left the party so suddenly yesterday, and Catherine had offered a carefully edited version of events. She explained that George had not been feeling well, and they needed to take care of him. Charlotte had accepted this at face value, though she was old enough to sense that something more significant had happened. Louis, at 7 years old, had been more interested in whether they could have another party soon with the croquet set. The household staff moved through their duties with quiet efficiency, but there was an undercurrent of tension in every interaction. Everyone knew what had happened by now, and the more experienced staff members understood this was the kind of incident that could have far-reaching implications. Security protocols would be reviewed and likely tightened. Access to family events would become more restricted. The easy, relatively relaxed atmosphere that had been cultivated for the children's benefit might have to give way to more rigid control. In London, the Palace Press Office was dealing with its first media inquiries about the garden party incident. Some photographer had managed to capture images of the moment when security surrounded Tom. And while the photos were not clear enough to show exactly what was happening, they were certainly enough to spark questions. The press secretary had drafted several potential responses depending on how much information eventually became public. Everything from a full statement acknowledging the incident to a simple denial that anything significant had occurred. King Charles had returned to London for morning meetings that could not be postponed, but he remained in constant communication with his staff at the estate. He had made it clear that he wanted to be informed immediately of any developments, any change in the situation. Before leaving, he had spoken with Camilla, a conversation that had been difficult for both of them. She had been devastated by what her son had done. Torn between maternal love and recognition of the seriousness of his actions, Camilla had asked if she should resign her position, if it would be better for the family if she stepped back. Charles had refused to even consider it, making it clear that she bore no responsibility for Tom's behavior. They were separate issues, he insisted, and she had worked too hard and come too far to have her position undermined by her adult son's poor choices. But Camilla could not shake the feeling that her presence now made things awkward, that every time William or Catherine looked at her they would think of Tom grabbing George. She had written a letter to George, separate from the note to his parents. It was a difficult letter to compose. She was trying to strike the right tone between acknowledging what happened and not making it a bigger issue than it already was. She told George she was proud of how he had handled himself, that his composure and grace under pressure showed his strength of character. She apologized for what her son had done and assured George that it reflected nothing about him and everything about Tom's own problems. She asked George to remember that adults sometimes made terrible mistakes, but that did not excuse them or make them acceptable. The letter was delivered by a trusted lady-in-waiting, who reported back that George had read it carefully and seemed genuinely touched by the gesture. He had not written a response yet, but he had thanked the lady-in-waiting and said he would think about what Camilla had said. For George, the whole situation remained confusing. He liked Camilla well enough, saw her at family dinners and holidays, knew she made his grandfather happy. The idea that he should feel differently about her because of what Tom did seemed strange to him. By mid-morning, the royal legal team had completed their assessment of the situation. Their conclusion was that there was definitely grounds for criminal assault charges, but they recommended against pursuing them unless Tom failed to comply with the conditions Charles had laid out. The reasoning was pragmatic rather than merciful. A criminal case would be a media spectacle that could last months, would require George to testify, and would ultimately result in what would probably be a suspended sentence or community service, given that Tom had no prior record and the injury. While Riel was relatively minor, William was frustrated by this advice, but had to acknowledge the logic. He spent an hour on the phone with his own legal advisors. People separate from the palace legal team, getting a second opinion. Their assessment was similar, though they noted that if William wanted to push for prosecution anyway, it was absolutely his right as George's father. The decision would ultimately have to be his and Catherine's, not the palace's or Charles's or anyone else's. Catherine was dealing with her own emotions about the incident. She had always been fiercely protective of her children, working hard to give them as normal a childhood as possible despite their unique circumstances. The idea that someone had hurt George, had put hands on him in anger, triggered a maternal rage that surprised her with its intensity. She wanted consequences for Tom, wanted him to hurt the way George had hurt. But she also recognized that her desire for revenge was not necessarily the same as doing what was best for her son. She went to find George mid-morning. Discovering him in the estate's library, attempting to focus on a book about World War II aircraft, he looked up when she entered, and she could see he had not really been reading but just staring at the same page. She sat down beside him and asked how he was really feeling. Not the polite answer he gave when staff members asked, but the truth. George was quiet for a long time, and Catherine waited patiently, not pushing. Finally, George said that what bothered him most was feeling like he had done something wrong. Even though he knew intellectually that he had not, he kept replaying the moment in his mind, wondering if he had said something or done something that set Tom off. Catherine's heart broke a little hearing this, recognizing the self-blame that victims often felt even when they were clearly blameless. She explained carefully that Tom's actions were about Tom's problems, not about anything George had done. She told him that adults were responsible for controlling themselves, that George bore absolutely no fault for what happened. George listened, but did not seem entirely convinced. He asked why Tom had been so angry at him, what he had done to make Tom hate him. Catherine emphasized that Tom did not hate him, that Tom had been dealing with his own issues and had taken them out on the wrong person at the wrong time. It was unfair, it was wrong, but it was not personal. George absorbed this information with the seriousness he brought to all difficult topics, his young mind working to make sense of adult complications that even adults struggled to understand. They talked for nearly an hour, covering everything from George's immediate emotional response to his worries about seeing Tom again at future family events. Catherine assured him that would not be happening, that Tom would not be present at any gathering George attended. George asked if that meant family events would be awkward, if there would always be this tension hanging over everything. Catherine admitted honestly that things might be uncomfortable for a while, but that the family would work through it because they always did. Meanwhile, in his home in London, Tom was having the worst day of his life. The full reality of what he had done had settled over him like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. His phone had not stopped ringing since he left the estate, but he had answered only a handful of calls. His sister, Laura, had called, her voice tight with anger and disappointment. Friends had reached out, some supportive, others clearly distancing themselves. His ex-wife had sent a vicious text message essentially blaming him for ruining his own life. The tabloid newspapers had gotten wind that something happened at the garden party. The morning editions carried speculative stories with headlines about drama at a royal event and questions about an unnamed incident. The palace had released a brief statement saying simply that a private family matter had been handled internally and would not be discussed publicly. This denial only fueled more speculation. And Tom knew it was only a matter of time before someone leaked his name and the details of what he had done. He had contacted a lawyer despite Malcolm's suggestion that it was not yet necessary. The lawyer had listened to Tom's account of events and delivered some brutal truths. If charged, Tom would almost certainly be convicted based on witness testimony and physical evidence. His best hope would be to accept responsibility, show genuine remorse, and hope for leniency. Fighting the charges or trying to claim George had provoked him somehow would be disastrous, turning public opinion even more harshly against him. Tom had also begun to realize the economic consequences of his actions. His work as a food critic and writer depended on his reputation and connections. Many of those connections ran through royal circles or people who moved in royal circles. He could already feel doors closing, invitations being withdrawn, opportunities evaporating. His income would suffer, his lifestyle would have to change, and all of it was his own fault. He had thrown away everything for a moment of anger he could not even fully explain. Back at the estate, Princess Charlotte had figured out that something more serious than George feeling unwell had happened. She was 9 years old and perceptive, good at reading the mood in a room and picking up on things adults tried to hide. She cornered George in the afternoon, demanding to know what really happened. George, torn between wanting to protect his sister and needing someone his own age to talk to, told her an edited version of events. Charlotte's reaction was immediate and fierce. She wanted to know who had hurt her brother and what punishment they would receive. The protective instinct between the siblings ran both ways, and Charlotte was indignant on George's behalf. George appreciated her anger, but also found himself in the odd position of slightly defending Tom, explaining that the man had been upset about something else and had not really meant to hurt him. Charlotte was having none of it, declaring that adults should know better and that Tom should be sent to prison. Their conversation was overheard by Louis, who had been playing nearby. The youngest sibling understood less of the nuances, but grasped that someone had been mean to George. His solution was simpler and more direct. He thought their father should go punch whoever had hurt George, a suggestion that, under different circumstances, might have been amusing. George and Charlotte both tried to explain why that was not how things worked. But Louis remained convinced that bullies needed to be dealt with physically. William, learning of these conversations later from a staff member, felt a complex mix of pride in his children's loyalty to each other and sadness. That they were being exposed to these adult problems. He and Catherine had worked so hard to give them childhoods that felt normal and safe, to protect them from the harsher realities of royal life. But incidents like this were reminders that complete protection was impossible, that their positions made them targets in ways ordinary children never had to worry about. As evening approached, the palace made a decision about how to handle the media situation. A brief statement would be released confirming that an incident occurred at a private family event. It was being handled through appropriate channels and that no further comment would be made. The statement carefully avoided naming Tom or specifying what happened, but it acknowledged enough to shut down some of the wilder speculations circulating online and in the tabloids. The statement was released at 6 in the evening, time to hit the evening news cycle. Within minutes, reporters were camped outside Tom's home, though he refused to come out or make any statement. Royal commentators appeared on various news programs, speculating about what could have happened and what the implications might be. Some noted that Tom had been absent from recent family photos and events, reading significance into his peripheral status that may or may not have existed before the incident. In the estate library, George was reading Camilla's letter for the third time. Each reading revealed new layers of meaning, and he was trying to formulate a response that was appropriate and honest. He understood that what he wrote would be seen by others beyond just Camilla, that it would be analyzed and discussed. But he also wanted to write something genuine, something that expressed his actual feelings rather than just what protocol demanded. He began drafting a response longhand, crossing out words and starting over multiple times. He told Camilla he appreciated her letter and understood that she was not responsible for Tom's actions. He said he was sad about what happened, but mostly confused. He wished Tom had just talked about whatever was bothering him instead of grabbing his arm. He finished by saying he hoped this would not change things between them, that he still thought of her as his grandfather's wife and an important person in the family. Catherine found him working on the letter and read it over his shoulder. She hugged him from behind, resting her chin on top of his head for a moment. She told him the letter was perfect, that it struck exactly the right tone of forgiveness without dismissing what happened. George seemed relieved by her approval, and together they made a clean final copy that he signed with his careful signature. The letter would be delivered in the morning, adding one small moment of grace to a situation that had precious little of it. 3 weeks after the incident, the royal family gathered for a private dinner that had been planned months in advance. The atmosphere was noticeably different from previous family gatherings. Queen Camilla was present, but quieter than usual, clearly conscious of the elephant in the room, even though Tom's name had not been mentioned once during the evening. King Charles made efforts to keep conversation flowing, asking the children about their studies and upcoming activities, but there was an underlying tension that no amount of polite small talk could completely erase. Prince George had returned to school the Monday after the garden party incident, and his parents had been prepared for questions or reactions from classmates. To their surprise, the school had managed to keep any knowledge of the event from spreading among the students. The tight-knit community of parents had apparently agreed to keep the matter private, not discussing it with their children. George's teachers had been briefed to watch for any signs of emotional distress or behavioral changes, but the young prince had seemed remarkably resilient in private moments. However, Catherine noticed small changes in her son. He was more reserved around adults he did not know well, maintaining greater physical distance than before. At public events, he positioned himself closer to his protection officers, unconsciously seeking the security of their presence. He had also started asking more questions about the role of security in his life, wanting to understand protocols and procedures in a way he never had before. The incident had awakened in him an awareness of vulnerability that could not be reversed. William had spoken extensively with the protection officer who had intervened during the incident. James had been reinstated after a thorough review concluded that he had acted appropriately, and that the security arrangements had been reasonable given the setting and circumstances. William had personally thanked him and made sure George knew that James was in no way at fault. The young prince had written James a note expressing gratitude for his quick action, a gesture that had deeply moved the career protection officer. The decision about whether to press criminal charges against Tom remained unresolved. William and Catherine had agreed to wait and see if Tom complied with all the conditions Charles had laid out. So far, he had. Tom had made no public statements, had not attempted to contact George, and had quietly withdrawn from anything connected to royal life. His compliance had been total and immediate. Whether motivated by genuine remorse or fear of consequences was unclear. Tom himself was struggling with the aftermath, in ways he had not anticipated. The shame was constant and crushing, a weight that colored every interaction and every moment. He had lost work opportunities as word quietly spread through professional networks about what he had done. His relationship with his own children had been damaged, as they struggled to understand why they could no longer see their royal cousins or attend family events. His ex-wife had filed for sole custody, citing the incident as evidence of poor judgment and potential danger. He had begun seeing a therapist, trying to understand the anger that had driven his actions that day. The sessions were difficult, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, his resentments, and his failures to manage his emotions appropriately. The therapist had helped him see that the incident with George was not an isolated moment of madness, but rather the culmination of months of stress, frustration, and poor coping mechanisms. Understanding why he had done it did not excuse it, but it gave him a framework for ensuring it never happened again. Camilla had not spoken to Tom since the incident, honoring the boundaries that had been set. The separation from her son caused her genuine pain, but she understood it was necessary. She had written him one letter, delivered through an intermediary, expressing her love for him while making clear her disappointment in his actions. She told him that their relationship would eventually be repaired, but only after proper time had passed and amends had been made. The letter had made Tom cry, confronting him with the cost of his actions in terms of relationships he valued. Meanwhile, the palace had been working on revised security protocols for family events. The review had identified several areas where procedures could be tightened without making gatherings feel oppressive or destroying the relaxed atmosphere the family preferred. Background checks for all guests would be more thorough. Security personnel would maintain closer proximity to the children while still allowing them freedom to interact naturally. Plans would be developed for various threat scenarios, including threats from family members or close associates. Prince George had been consulted about the security changes, another sign of his growing maturity in his unique position. He had expressed concern that the new protocols not make events feel too formal or controlled, that his siblings and cousins still be able to enjoy themselves. His thoughtfulness impressed the security team, and they worked to incorporate his feedback into their planning. It was a delicate balance between protection and normalcy, one that the family had always struggled with, and that the incident had made more complicated. The media attention had eventually died down after the initial burst of speculation. Without specific details being confirmed, and with no one involved willing to speak publicly, the story had nowhere to go. Some outlets had correctly identified Tom as being involved in some kind of incident, but the exact nature of what happened remained protected by the palace's silence and the loyalty of those who had witnessed it. The official line remained that it was a private family matter being handled internally. Charlotte and Louis had eventually learned more details about what happened to George. Despite their parents' efforts to shield them, the school grapevine had proven impossible to completely control. Fragments of information had reached them through classmates, whose parents worked in various capacities for the royal household. William and Catherine had then been forced to have fuller conversations with their younger children about the incident, trying to provide context and reassurance while being honest about what had occurred. Charlotte had taken the news hard, her protective instincts toward her older brother making her angry on his behalf all over again. She had wanted to write Tom an angry letter, telling him exactly what she thought of adults who hurt children. Catherine had gently discouraged this, explaining that while Charlotte's feelings were valid, sending such a letter would not help the situation and might make things worse. Charlotte had reluctantly agreed, but had made William promise that Tom would never be allowed near any of them again. Louis, with the emotional flexibility of a 7-year-old, had processed the information quickly and then largely moved on. His main concern had been whether George was still hurt, and once reassured that his brother was physically fine, Louis had returned to his usual energetic self. He occasionally made comments about the man who was mean to George, usually in the context of explaining why they were not seeing certain people at family events anymore. But it did not seem to weigh on him the way it did on Charlotte. As weeks turned into a month, a new normal began to establish itself. George's bruises had long since faded, leaving no physical evidence of what had happened. The emotional impact was harder to quantify, but seemed manageable. The young prince had not developed fear or anxiety around public events, though he was noticeably more aware of his surroundings and the people in them. His therapist, whom he saw regularly as part of the support provided to all the royal children, reported that he was processing the incident in a healthy way and showed no signs of trauma. William and Catherine remained vigilant, watching for any delayed reactions or emotional difficulties that might emerge. They had been briefed on the various ways trauma could manifest, the potential for issues to surface weeks or even months after an incident. But George continued to seem stable, his routines unchanged, his mood generally positive. He talked about the incident when asked, but did not dwell on it obsessively. His ability to compartmentalize and move forward was remarkable, though his parents wondered sometimes if it was genuine resilience or learned behavior from a lifetime of being watched and judged. The relationship between the main royal family and Queen Camilla gradually normalized, though it would never be quite the same. There was a shared understanding now of how quickly things could go wrong, how one person's actions could create ripples throughout the entire family structure. Camilla was careful in her interactions with William and Catherine, never presuming familiarity, always deferring to their wishes regarding the children. They, in turn, made efforts to ensure she did not feel punished for Tom's behavior, including her in family events and treating her with respect and warmth. The question of eventual reconciliation with Tom hung in the air, unspoken but present. Charles believed that at some point in the future, after sufficient time had passed and appropriate accountability had been demonstrated, some limited contact might be restored. William was less certain, his protective instincts making him resistant to the idea of Tom ever being near his children again. Catherine occupied a middle ground, willing to consider forgiveness, but only with strict boundaries and safeguards in place. Tom himself had begun the slow process of rebuilding his life from the ruins of his own creation. He had found some work writing for smaller publications, willing to overlook the scandal. He had maintained his therapy sessions and had begun attending support groups for anger management. He had written multiple letters to George that he never sent. Efforts to articulate his remorse, an apology that never felt adequate. His lawyer had advised that if criminal charges were ever filed, these letters could be used as evidence of genuine remorse. But Tom's motivation was not strategic. He genuinely needed to express what he felt, even if the words never reached their intended recipient. His relationship with his own children had been partially repaired through consistent effort and the passage of time. They were old enough to understand that adults made mistakes, even serious ones, and that people could work to become better. Tom had been honest with them about what he had done and why it was wrong. Using the incident as a teaching moment about managing emotions and the importance of self-control, his ex-wife remained hostile. But the custody battle had settled into an arrangement that gave Tom regular access to his children, though supervised at first. 6 weeks after the incident, Prince George attended his first major public event since the garden party. It was a ceremony honoring youth volunteers at which he was presenting awards. The palace press office had debated whether his appearance was premature, whether he needed more time away from public scrutiny. But George himself had wanted to participate, viewing it as an important step in not letting what happened change his life or limit his activities. His parents had agreed, respecting his wishes while ensuring extra security measures were in place. The event went smoothly. With George performing his duties with his usual combination of natural charm and carefully practiced protocols, observers noted perhaps a slight increase in seriousness, a more measured quality to his interactions, but overall he appeared confident and comfortable. The photographs from the event showed a young prince growing into his role, and none of the visible coverage mentioned or alluded to the garden party incident. It seemed the media had collectively decided to move on, or at least to respect the privacy the palace had requested. That evening, William and Catherine watched the news coverage with George. All three of them seated together on a sofa in their private quarters. George seemed pleased with how the event had gone, pointing out moments he thought he had handled well and asking for feedback on areas where he could improve. The conversation was normal, focused on his public duties and performance, with no mention of security concerns or the incident that had made everyone more cautious. After George went to bed, William and Catherine remained on the sofa, finally allowing themselves to relax completely. Catherine leaned against William's shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence for a long time. Finally, William spoke, his voice quiet in the dim room. He said he was proud of George, of how the boy had handled everything thrown at him. Catherine agreed, adding that their son had shown remarkable maturity and strength of character. They discussed how lucky they were, how easily things could have been worse, how grateful they were for the protection officers and staff who kept their families safe. They also acknowledged, in that private moment, how the incident had changed them as parents. They were more cautious now, less willing to assume safety, more aware of potential threats, even from unexpected sources. The innocence they had tried to preserve for their children had been damaged, not destroyed, but definitely diminished. It was another step in the ongoing process of their children growing up in the peculiar circumstances of royal life, where privilege and danger coexisted in ways most families never had to consider. King Charles had his own private reflections on the incident as time passed. He thought about the delicate balance of family relationships, the complications of blended families, even at the highest levels of society, and the impossible expectations placed on everyone connected to the crown. He worried about George and the burden the boy would carry throughout his life, the constant awareness of being watched and judged and targeted. He felt guilt about Camilla's pain, even though she had done nothing wrong, frustration with Tom for creating such a mess. But Charles also felt pride in how the family had handled the crisis. They had come together, supported each other, made difficult decisions, and emerged stronger in some ways. The incident could have torn them apart, could have created lasting divisions and resentments. Instead, it had reminded them of what mattered most: protecting the children and maintaining the stability of the institution they all served. It was not the outcome anyone would have chosen, but it was the best possible outcome given the circumstances. Queen Camilla, in her own quiet way, had also found some resolution. She had accepted that her son's actions were not her responsibility, but that they would always be associated with her. She had redoubled her efforts in her official duties, working to show that she took her role seriously and could be counted on despite family complications. She had received George's letter in response to hers, and she kept it in a drawer in her private desk. Reading it occasionally when she needed reminded of the capacity for forgiveness and grace. The letter from a 10-year-old boy had moved her deeply. George had not offered empty platitudes or pretended everything was fine. He had acknowledged the difficulty of the situation while affirming their relationship and his understanding that families were complicated. His maturity had shown through every carefully chosen word, and Camilla had shown the letter to Charles with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in the young man George was becoming, and sadness that he had been forced to demonstrate such maturity in response to being hurt. As summer approached and the family prepared for their annual holiday retreat, there was a sense of having weathered a storm. The incident was not forgotten, would never be forgotten really, but it had been integrated into the family story, another chapter in the complex narrative of royal life. George would carry the memory with him always, a reminder that even in protected environments, unexpected dangers could emerge. His siblings would remember that sometimes adults failed to behave as they should. His parents would remain forever more vigilant, their protective instincts sharpened by how close they had come to worse outcomes. Tom Parker Bowles would live with his actions for the rest of his life. The moment of grabbing Prince George's arm defining him in ways that his career and other accomplishments never would. He had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that everyone was responsible for their own behavior regardless of personal circumstances. Whether he would eventually find redemption or remain permanently exiled from the family that had once been part of his identity remained to be seen. The path forward was unclear, dependent on continued good behavior, genuine change, and the willingness of others to offer forgiveness when sufficient time had passed. The protection officer who had intervened, James, continued his duties with quiet professionalism. He had received commendations for his quick action, but he did not seek recognition or attention. For him, doing his job was reward enough, knowing that he had protected a child from potential harm. He watched Prince George at subsequent events, noting the boy's growing confidence and maturity, feeling a quiet satisfaction in having played a small role in keeping that growth possible. The garden party itself would not be repeated, at least not in the same format. Future events would have different structures, different security arrangements, different guest lists. The innocence of casual family gatherings had been lost, replaced by more careful planning and heightened awareness. It was a price everyone agreed was necessary. Even as they mourned the loss of spontaneity and ease that had once characterized such events, in the end, the incident became a marker in the life of the royal family, a before and after moment that changed perspectives and priorities. Prince George had been hurt, not seriously but meaningfully, and that hurt had rippled out to touch everyone connected to the family. They had responded with grace and strength, protecting the vulnerable, maintaining dignity, refusing to let one person's poor choices destroy what they had built together. It was not a happy story, but it was a story of resilience, family bonds tested and holding, of a young prince learning difficult lessons about life in the public eye. And in that resilience there was hope that whatever challenges came next, they would face them together, stronger for having survived this particular storm.